Hello, everyone, and welcome to another LSA CPD. My name's Jason Sayer. I'm really lucky to have Cany Ash of Ash Sakula today. Today, Cany, we're talking about small sites and how architects can essentially make the most of them. And Cany will be using the work conducted with Lewisham Council and RCKa on the Small Sites Supplementary Planning Document, SPD, to fuel this conversation. For those of you who don't know, but I presume there's a lot of return visitors here today, we try to give conversation, discussion, equal billing to the talks that take place. So talks last about 30 minutes, and the discussion Q&A also lasts around about 30 minutes. And if you do want to ask a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself, and we can have hopefully a nice, fulfilling conversation like we've been having recently. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Cany. Thank you very much today, Cany.
Thank you for inviting me. It's really a really interesting topic, particularly because it touches so much of so many threads that come out of how we're rethinking the city and how we can encourage people to be involved in city making, more people involved in city making. And I'm just going to share my screen now to take you to a little bit of imagery. So can everybody see that?
Yep.
Great. So this was a project which started in September, and it started with a big cycle ride, which we did with members of RCKa, the architects we're collaborating with, and quite a few people from the council and various people we picked up along the way, people that we knew something about Lewisham. And it was about 36 miles, I think, in the end. We went up and down Vale. It was a very hot day. And just Lewisham is vast and quite complicated and quite hilly. But I think that it was really important that we had that time to kind of look at corners that had been successful in getting planning permission, and some other sites which were more problematic, and some which were very celebrated, because it gave us a kind of shared understanding of the direction of travel for this commission, which was to do a piece of supplementary planning guidance to help more people get into contributing and densifying and creating more homes. So you can see on the, hopefully on the right here, that some of it was, the design work was actually designing how the information could be shared. And that's quite complicated, because before you know it, you've kind of like gone down a rabbit hole and there's too much detail, or you've kind of fallen back into architect speak and you haven't really kind of realized that, you know, we often have a quite strange language which might use normal words, but we mean them in a different way. And one of the things we have is documents supporting this document is a glossary with those, a lot of those terms explained really well. So Ash Sakula have been involved in trying to, in various ways, trying to get more people excited about architecture and building and neighbourhood making. So we did, for instance, this project with Sheffield University that you can look up, collectivecustombuilds.org, which was trying to take a database of projects, successful projects where people had pooled their money and created a governance structure and a place. And that was, we tried to make that, rather than just a dry load of documents, we tried to make it almost like a shopping site, and you could go shopping for your knowledge. And there was also a movie that went with it. So you could click this movie in the middle where it says click to pay, and at the bottom you'd get this moving set of documents, information, case studies, bits of policy, comparative studies and things like that. And I think that, you know, given the fact that we've just been invited to talk about this with Sam Brown, who is has actually worked a lot in Lewisham with John Broome and been the architect behind the success of Russ, which is a collective co-housing project. These things do live on and they do have an impact, and we've been invited, the two of us, to speak in New Zealand in a few weeks' time, because they're doing a kind of big Maori meeting looking at how collective traditions from the past can come forward. So that may be a sort of a little bit of a red herring, but it's not really, because I think that this whole project is about communicating to people who might be overawed by, or just not feel it's their territory, by the idea of building a home or getting involved as a small developer or small builder. So this is an example of how we tried to make things like square meters tactile and easily understood. We tried to explain that, you know, everybody was welcome at the table, and that it was really important to make Lewisham's housing supply more resilient and more affordable through more people becoming agents in that mission, and for the kind of local knowledge to really energize how to find more space for people and increase the feeling of neighborhood at the same time. So one of the things that we were doing was we were working within the policy H2 area, which means that you could always walk to transport. So we were looking at car-free schemes, and that is sort of PTAL 3 to 6 or 800 meters to a train or a really regular bus. But still, like, you know, it's a kind of, it's a bit like staring at the stars, because there's so much in a bit of city like this that one has to feel some connection with. So what we did is, well, actually what RCKa were amazing with their talent at mapping and analysing. And we got a kind of grip of the area through going through, looking at applications, looking at successful, failed applications, looking at site ownerships, looking at opportunities within different site typologies, and getting quite granular with it. So this is just showing you some of the kind of things that we got into. And then we were like also looking at, sorry, somebody just phoned, looking at how would you go about it as somebody embarking on this, like what is the kind of snakes and ladders route map that you take through to getting planning for a site. And we also looked at, you know, before sort of devising a project and getting planning, obviously you have to find the site. And so finding a site and finding land, as we all know, is just feels sometimes like a needle in a haystack. But this was some pointers to the fact that if you walking around the block and you just notice that there's a little bit of garden that looks very uncared for, and that maybe it has a street frontage, maybe you can find out who owns that land, and maybe you can write them a really nice letter or knock on their door with a bunch of flowers or something. So it doesn't have to be only estate agents, say, or you know, housing associations and bigger developers who notice these things. Often there's opportunities, and you can make your own luck by finding those places. We also were looking very much in the planning stage at how do we create an environment in Lewisham where there is an appetite for innovation and invention in the architecture, so that there's it's not just stylish quite closed up blocks of space, but we wanted to see how we could create in every street there's a kind of a different setting, how those in conservation areas could be treated as places which were not full of you know, problems which you would not solve, but almost a kind of call to quality which would inspire you, and that could spread throughout the rest of the borough too. So an attitude which I think a lot of planning officers also need to get on board with, but I think it's like a kind of collective act to raise the quality of submissions and chase away the cynicism and try and like create really good places. We also were, well, we were blessed, we're on the heritage side with working with Catherine Croft from the 20th Century Society, and she was very interesting about like what is heritage and how a lot of Lewisham probably should be listed, because people haven't just quite caught up with the history yet. But she's also, we were working hand in hand with Melissa Merriweather, who runs Green Consult, who is absolutely brilliant at policy around sustainability. And we were trying to create an appetite for sustainability, not just from sort of the moral imperative, but also an economic rationale, which meant that you were building something which was going to make more sense of your money as well as everything else. And one of the diagrams that she did that was really useful was looking at the baseline of building regulations and how you build up from there, and how effective passive design is against you know, in-use energy, or you know, the kind of gizmos that one might, you know, very legitimately attach to a house, and then you know how one might, recognizing one's on a small site, have to offset something, but the fundamental thing is to get the shape of the building right and create opportunity for living a low carbon lifestyle in that way. So I'm just going to sort of sweep through some places that we felt deserved some attention as examples of opportunities. This one is about the fact that there is actually quite a lot of slack land. It's not in the suburbs all around London and other cities, where it's not like somebody loves a patch of green grass or an area of hard paving, but it just so happens that that's where two roads split. And so it's become a kind of, it's seen as part of the highways rather than part of developable land. And so we were trying to show with these cartoons ways in which one might sort of invent these sites from public land and actually enhance the placemaking in a neighbourhood. Or the way that one can sometimes invent a site that's you know, in an air rights situation that can give a lot back to the street. Or on a corner where there's, you know, there's the end of one terrace and another terrace hasn't quite started yet. If you actually look at that plot, there's sometimes room for, you know, 3 families to live, and create a sort of really memorable corner, which lots of people navigate by. Or some places where you've got a kind of a vernacular that's built up of, say here, these kind of rabbit ear, like semi-detached houses, how one can like do a riff off that and make something really quite brilliant, but still make it feel very rooted in that place. Or here at the end of a terrace, there's a kind of, you know, the front garden's always been the Englishman's kind of, you know, buffer to the world in his castle, but what would it feel like if that tradition was like updated to a 21st century sort of aesthetic, where maybe you want to grow some kind of quite, you might want to grow some food there, you might want to sit out and chat, you might want to incorporate your bins rather than just let them sort of hang out. So, and you might like to sit in the window and look up and down the street. And this was, you know, an example of where maybe in conservation areas, there's an idea that you shouldn't go above a ridge line, but how you work with that doesn't necessarily mean that you just stitch back the most boring infill, but you can play with the volumetrically with those gap sites to create a lot of gardening opportunities, bike storage, bin storage, and entrance sequences, which can be animate a street. So one of the big problems that we had is that we, you know, in the local plan and very fervently among councillors and a lot of people in Lewisham, was the idea that you shouldn't build over garden space because we need that green canopy over London. We should increase it 30%, and we need as much biodiversity as we can get. And so it seemed like, you know, you're solving one problem, maybe creating some more affordable homes, but then if you're taking away the future prosperity of the diverse life in the borough, that doesn't make sense either. So there were some rules that in this SPD, you probably noticed there are not that many rules, but there were a few, and one of them was that you could be quite confident that it wasn't a waste of time applying for planning permission if you had a street frontage. So this is illustrating this diagram, the fact that there's you can have a front door onto the pavement, onto a street, maybe put your garden on the side of a house, and instead of having two garages, which are out of favour, you could have a car-free house. And the people in the house on the right of this screen, they would sell you that plot, and then that might pay for their, might pay for their care, or it might help somebody get a, you know, some go back to college, or, you know, all sorts of good things can come out of people suddenly having a windfall like this and still having a reasonable garden. And so we were looking very much at those opportunities. Here's an example of 4 garages that have been converted. And then we were thinking, what would happen if the neighbours all got together in the pub when they're allowed and decided that it would be a really good idea to sell a larger piece of land, or a group approach them with an idea that they wanted to live together. How would that happen? Because you could make the entrance off the street from the side street, and then you could have all of the front doors opening onto that little laneway. And if you extend that rationale, you could make new laneways and create some pretty amazing car-free, cycle-friendly, child-friendly places. This is already the case in quite a few really interesting muses in around Brockley and Forest Hill and other places, and a lot of them have been developed, you know, from a garage, and developed with quite a lot of quirkiness. There's also the backland sites, which often also have garages on them, or underused or unused buildings. So there's, when you look on Google Earth, you can often plunge yourself down into a place where you can find that you could drive in and drive out of a place, a backland site. So you wouldn't have to have big turning circles, or maybe you can design it so that you do have the turning circles, and that all works. But something which increases security at the back of gardens, which creates some conviviality for people walking through their dogs or just walking can help the neighborhood and not just the people finding the homes. So those were some of the types of opportunities we looked at. Then we had, these are the last slides I'll show you, and it was an attempt at doing a design guide, which wasn't a design guide. It was more a sharing of design thinking, which could create a rationale, which might make you wonder if you could do something. But it's almost in the way of nudging rather than the way of precepts. So there were 3 toolkits that we, you know, sometimes we wondered whether something went in one toolkit or another, but when you have a toolkit, you have to have a toolbox. You have to decide what the tools are in it. So this first page is showing you the first toolbox, which was about sustainability through planting and dealing with water in a clever way. So this is vertical greening, living roofs, collecting rainwater. So really thinking about the passage of rainwater over development, creating a narrative which goes hand in glove with some trees, which often will be around longer than the buildings. But how do you create a landscape and incorporate nature and trees into it? And then solar panels, which is really tricky. And then the next toolkit is about how you think about internal space and how that creates a logic within the house to bring in light and air. And often on these small sites, there'd be a very tight envelope you'd have to work within, and also not too much outlook. So you need to think carefully about how you're going to live in the place, and then perhaps you might end up with a courtyard plan, or you create amenity spaces at different levels, how you would sometimes be able to make within one house form 2 houses. That's quite a London vernacular, where the lower flat would have the garden and then the upper one would have a roof terrace. Then the absolute joy of skylights over a shower or a bed or drying clothes. The fact that with all of the work that we're doing at home, a bedroom is not just a bedroom, it's very often a workplace for 2 people, and how to think through that. And bringing daylight into a hall where you spend quite a bit of time, you know, putting on kids' shoes. And so if you can bring in light, natural light into places rather than turning on lights, that is hugely beneficial, because we're spending more carbon actually turning on lights in homes now than heating. And then sunshine is so good for mental health, as we all know. Chinese gardens, as we call them, because you find the Chinese are particularly brilliant in their traditional architecture at using an incredibly narrow space to make a landscape and to bring in light and air. So to be inspired by that, to think always about how to create more sculpture in the city, reducing the bulk, creating more drama with the architecture. And thinking about entrances, because they're really the way that these projects speak to the street and create memorable moments, both for occupants and for people just passing by, and how they need to incorporate rubbish and bikes and maybe a bench for an old person to sit down while they take out their keys, or just a stranger who needs to sit down. So all these things, like to host the occupants and create more of a vibrant language on the street. Sometimes, though, it's quite good to just go for the calmest thing. So calmness is good, diversity is good, like we're showing this kind of idea of lots of different people maybe having plots and having different ideas about how they want to live, and those getting set against each other cheek by jowl. And then the bottom one is about the fact that corners are so important for, they're almost like the puppet theatre of the city, you know, where the buildings talk together, and that one should think about those opportunities are very special moments. Gates we talked about a lot, or basically in the FAQs, you'll see that gates are not welcome really to any of these developments. But sometimes, you know, if you want kids to play in a courtyard or something, you are going to have some gates. How can those gates feel more like a kind of layering, a veil of intrigue, a place that harbours vines rather than a keep out? So it's like, what's the iconography of your gated development if you have gates at some point? And how can you mix in activities in shared yards, which are very inclusive of old people and young people, and create a lot of different opportunities for softness or for hardness or for bringing out picnics and things. And then a rather strange drawing I did on the right hand side is thinking about, like, when you're walking down a street, actually it's pretty important to think about the way that in steep perspective, small jumps forward and back can have a big impact and make a place feel really lively. So if you, rather than just giving it away to kind of front garden, maybe it's kind of interesting to create a volume which you can stack some bikes in, but you can also grow a vine up and you can put a bin inside. So there is a way in which we need to move on with the architecture so that it actually reflects the demands that we have now, post-car, and with a need for more light and space in the home. And lastly, this is pretty obvious, you know, some buildings are more important than others. It really makes so much sense to keep the cars on the street and not let them cross over into and park in front of houses, because then you keep that very special public realm pavement area for kids to play on and for as a safe place to walk. If you need to kind of like get a load of cars, maybe you could make them, cluster them together and put them under a load of trees, maybe call it an orchard. But the fact is that every case is different, and it was just to open the discussion of how you deal with these things and create a friendly place to walk through. And then at the bottom right is sometimes you don't really have a front garden. So like, what can you do when you've really got to compress a landscape into your front wall on a small site? And actually you can do quite a lot just by a small setback, the 600 mil that you need as a cover in front of the door, and a window box which kind of sort of sets into the window area. You can make places feel, you can vertically green in order to create that sense of front. Actually, I've got a few more, sorry. This is a tower house that we did actually up in Newcastle, where it's sort of 6 floors, but you have your living on the ground floor, and then you have a bedroom on each level. But that was just to show that, you know, not some sites will only work with this kind of solution because you've got to stay away from people's windows, and you have more space at the ground level, but as you go up you need to get quite petite. Suds, you know, we all know about it, but like, how are we going to actually just start bringing it into the public realm, making it a really normal thing that we have soggy fertile bits in front of our front doors? And this is looking again at the end of terrace situation, and the fact that sometimes you might be able to you know, pair up houses and create a lot of value. Where there was one house, you might be able to create 4. So these are some of the questions that we put in the SPD to the questions that we dreamt up that people might ask. And I think I'm going to leave those up there, or maybe I should stop sharing, I'm not sure. But it'd be good to go to questions, any questions people have got.
Tell you what you could do. I think if you could leave them there for, or no, it may, because the document's available online, I guess people can find it. I'll put a link to it as well. So yeah, if you do have any questions, like now's the time to kind of unmute as well. You can also put them in the chat as well if you'd not like me to read them out. I did have a few, so in case people are waiting for questions to formulate in their head, I can press ahead. You kind of mentioned kind of your own projects being serving as a precedent to kind of what you're doing, but I was wondering if there are any kind of beyond that realm that you were kind of riffing off or were learning from with your approach to developing small sites.
Yeah, I mean, like just when you walk around the block,
Yeah.
you see invention, don't you? And there's in the SPD and also in the associated documents, you can find some brilliant architecture from lots of different London architects and other architects. Not all of them in Lewisham, some in other boroughs. All of that is still going to be reviewed for the final. At the moment it's in draft form because it's out for consultation until the 1st of June. So I hope people will, you know, sort of share some thoughts on what they think of it and what they think's missing. But I think photographs and examples are really important. But I was just picking out on these drawings because it was the bit that I'd had most input into. And sometimes it gives you a little bit more freedom when you're drawing something to you know, to camp it up a bit so that you make the point really obviously.
Sure. I'd also make the point that, you know, I think people can raise on Zoom, you can raise your hand. So if you want to do that as well, I can then introduce you as well. But I was also going to ask, for those who maybe haven't read the SPD in detail, like how is the council encouraging development on these sites at the moment?
Well, they want to create, I think, 379 homes on small sites annually, as a sort of 10% of what they need to do overall. And there's a lot of passion in the council about small sites and about opening up development to more equality, diversity and inclusion. And so we, as well as talking to the architects, the great London architecture group, LAG, that work a lot in Lewisham, and talking with the planners and the people in the council who are responsible for landscape and highways and heritage. We also were talking to people online because we put up a website and people would ask lots of questions or make suggestions in there. So we've had quite an email exchange through this. And we've also worked with Lewisham College, working with young people on their ideas about, you know, we shared a list of possible small sites, and that they got quite excited about, sort of the idea of they themselves could be involved in changing a corner.
Sure. And is there kind of scope for community land trusts, for example, within that? Yeah.
There is, like, because this is a short talk, I've really only skimmed it. There's a lot of community land trusts in cooking up in Lewisham, and there's lots of co-housing groups, lots of community-led housing, and some of these sites are big enough to, you know, to fit 30 odd homes on them, so they're not all like just individual things.
I can see a question from Ronnie. Hi Ronnie, Ronnie's an alumni at the LSA. Ronnie asks, I saw a quick section in that last slide on planning applications. How amenable have you found authorities in your research and your work? Any advice for those of us trying to do these small sites projects, particularly to do with splitting properties?
I think that's a question about taking a larger unit and making 2 smaller units from it. Is it, Ronnie?
Because given this is over chat, Ronnie, if you want to unmute, you can.
It's actually Cameron.
Oh, sorry.
Cameron asked the question. Sorry, we're both here.
No, Cameron.
Hello. Yeah, particularly about splitting properties. We've looked at a couple of potential sites where that could be an issue, and I know that sometimes authorities aren't super happy with you trying to split up a larger property into smaller chunks. I was just wondering how amenable you found authorities to that.
Oh, I think they're very keen, as long as it fits the London plan size of units. I think that they have a distaste in Lewisham for large homes, larger than needed homes. They're very keen on right sizing. So yeah, I think they face a lot of kind of lackluster or even really terribly cynical applications. So you can imagine that if you put a bit of love and care into how you describe your rationale and what you're trying to do with the homes internally and externally, I think you'd find that they'd be very supportive.
Cool, thanks.
That answers the question. Cameron, thank you for coming. I can see we've got some other people in the audience as well, which are, I would argue, are well versed with small sites. So again, if you want to just come in with a comment as well, stuff like that would be helpful. Particularly, I can see Alan Crawford is lurking there, and I know he's definitely got an opinion on this matter.
Maybe I could just ask like a general question. What would make the most difference for anybody in the audience who thought about developing? Like what would be the thing that would make it tip the balance into it feeling really doable, as opposed to something which is just fraught with wasted effort? Is it a list of sites that you could apply to build on, a bit like the GLA have been doing with their small sites? Or is it a series of surgeries, that councils could run to, so that you could get some really fast advice? How many people here have ever developed a home? Like, can we do a poll?
We can. I can do that right now, actually. Yeah, we can do. Add a question. It takes about 30 seconds. I did this last time. It was quite good.
Oh, okay. I'm just wondering, Russell, are you on the call at the moment?
He was, I think.
Yeah, I'm here. No, I'm here.
All right. Okay. Well, it'd be great if you could add to this conversation, because
Sure.
You are so much the policy person, and when we first talked about this tender, I said, look, Russell, honestly, I'm not really sure that I'm the right person for a design code, because I can always think of a million reasons why it could be done, some different way. But actually, I think we had a really good collaboration, and it was the teaming up of different perspectives. Well, I just learned quite a lot. I learned a lot and got a bit more confident about thinking about legislation and things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the document is quite an interesting one, because it has to navigate its way. Well, the purpose for it to exist ostensibly is to help people put together good quality planning applications that are going to get first time approval. But let's be honest, the audience is extremely broad, not only for individuals who may have no expertise in or no understanding or experience of small site development, but also developers and builders, but also planning officers, because what we're hoping is this gives the planning officers confidence, and it empowers them to make decisions which aren't just that they can, because the problem with policy generally, particularly the Lewisham policy, is at the moment the local plan is more than 10 years out of date, and they're consulting on a new local plan, but we've got to navigate our way between the two. And what an SPD does is to interpret policy. It cannot provide additional or supersede any policy within the local plan documents. So it basically is a bit like the approved documents for the building regs. It's a way of interpreting planning policy. And what we're hoping to do is provide parameters within our guidance that's not too prescriptive, but provide parameters that if you've got a site of a particular configuration, and we've as Cany showed, that we've tried to understand the various the highly likely sites that typically occur in Lewisham. If you approach a site like that and you do it like this, and it's this high, and it's, you think about, have broom distances, and you think about size of gardens and all that sort of stuff, you've got a very high chance of success. So it's trying to remove the uncertainty without being too prescriptive about what everything should look like. But that applies equally to applicants and planning officers.
Yeah, I think that's it in a nutshell, is that the certainty allows people to feel they're not going to fritter away their time. But we were trying to get the certainty to be on the ambition for these sites, rather than just on allow a planning consultant to come and say, well, you said this in your SPD and we're doing it exactly like that. So you have to
and ultimately, and the guidance that the sort of flow chart that we set out, all of it really is intended as a nudge that, you can spend, if you're a non-expert applicant, you can spend an awful lot of time reading through all this policy and understanding our documents, but actually it's just better if you go and get a good architect. And that's what we're trying to do, is to promote using a good architect to get the best out of your site. So hopefully that will nudge people in that direction.
Well, you know what, I mean, in some ways there aren't enough great architects on the ground to fulfill that wish. I mean, sorry, there are lots of great architects, but a lot of these projects are quite long and involved. And I like what Deborah Saunt just said in the chat about a dedicated small sites member of the local planning team who can help would be great. That means that, like, a group of teenagers could get together and they might have some really good design ideas, and with the right kind of guidance, they might just go for it and get planning. That kind of ease of access is also quite attractive and builds the confidence. But I suppose that's a bit fraught with difficulties at times. Then Alan Crawford has just said in the chat that small sites don't contribute to the overall goals of providing more affordable homes. They just raise land values, like gentrification and stuff.
Yeah,
what do you think about?
Well, I mean, that actually the number one priority for Lewisham in commissioning us to do this, to write this document, was that it should deliver affordable homes. So I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, and that's certainly not the ambition of the document. I mean, clearly at the moment, largely due to the riskiness of developing small sites, the uncertainty over the planning system, that it tends to fall to those who can afford to take the risk, and therefore that raises land values. What we're trying to do is show that by removing that risk, it makes it more affordable, but also how collective development, and we make quite a big point of collective development, how if people get together and work in tandem and work collaboratively, actually is a way of developing affordable housing. Now, the CLT thing is interesting because you can't prescribe for community land trusts within planning policy. I mean, it's a residential use just like any other residential use, but you can create a planning framework that perhaps encourages collective development and community development rather than, let's say, a developer-led model.
And we were talking, weren't we, about the idea of separate demises, which might only be 6 square meters, which would get around the council's reluctance to get involved in live work, but would still allow people to build businesses very close to where they're trying to raise families and create that mixed use on a really granular level, like quite micro level. And that seemed to find favour as long as it had a kind of different use class.
I'm just going to interject, and I can see the results in the poll are more or less in. So about 38% have developed their home or a home, and 63, or just almost double, haven't. So it's quite interesting to see our audience. I was also going to point out another thing which Alan said. He's touching on his experience. He says often the hardest part is winning over neighbours who are usually impacted by development on backland sites.
Yeah. Well, we've been quite bold in some of our diagrams showing, for example, well, I mean, one of the fundamental problems with trying to develop in particularly suburban areas is the length of gardens, and how much of a rear garden should be protected from overlooking, particularly when you're looking at things like street facing side plots or backland development. And we've tried to quantify that within the document. Now, I think that's one of the areas that is going to come under an exceptional level of scrutiny. But is it right that if you've got a 30 or 40 meter long garden, that you should, that the entirety of that should be protected from any overlooking whatsoever, or is there a sort of graduated degree of overlooking that one might accept at the very end, as opposed to close to the back of your house or something? Now, the problem is that in current planning policy, there's a lot of it's completely subjective and completely open to interpretation by officers. And what we've tried to do is create some definitive values, some geometric values for that. But it's tricky. It is tricky, and I think that's absolutely right. That's one of the biggest problems that anybody will encounter.
Yeah,
and I think that trees have been another huge thing, because like very often at the end of those long gardens you get a little bit of woodland, and that's just the kind of space which might be acceptable for overlooking terms for building a home. But I think that as an architect, Russell, you've encountered some really frustrating planning application processes in Lewisham and elsewhere. And so it's not just the panacea isn't just to get a good architect. It's also we need to work with the whole culture, which is about saying yes to transformation and not treating it as the way to hold out the evil, but
that's absolutely right. And I think the London Plan Policy H2 that Cany referred to at the beginning, it does talk about incremental intensification within those areas, and a huge part of Lewisham does fall within that Policy H2 zone. So the assumption should be that incremental intensification of those areas is the sort of default interpretation of policy, and that not everything has to be, everything has to be exactly as it is now.
Yeah, I think we all felt that quite strongly in the council too. Reza, did you just turn on your camera to ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I was going to say it's more, well, what we have found is more about if the small size gets planning risk, and also the construction risk, which is the client has to face. How have you kind of do you take on a lot of surveys at the beginning to understand what you're dealing with, or would you go ahead with some sort of pre-app advice or a planning advice? Then you start to say, we do for example, ground surveys and for electrical and disposal surveys. We're finding clients coming to us, and we get sometimes we got planning in Sutton, for example, and they're finding the groundwork is now not mostly suitable for the project and things like that. How do you deal with those? And when because they don't want to spend so much money in terms of fees and then not to get planning.
Shall I answer that, Cany?
I don't know. I think it is risky. Everything in the
Yeah.
ground that's unknown is risky. And, you know, you used to be able to go down to the kind of drainage department and talk to some guy who'd like say, oh, well, I think it'll be okay. The clay stops here or something. But no, and I mean, the culture at the moment in London in buying sites is that, you know, the buyer beware, and you just have to be quite risk hungry, I'd say, to bid on things. And if you're very small, that isn't easy at all. If you're a bit bigger, you might say, oh, swings and roundabouts.
But yeah, that's right. And I also think that planning, the planning department can help by not requiring too much up front. So the idea of having to do invasive ground investigations prior to planning is, you know, is unreasonable, and that these things, you know, are necessary but should be conditioned. So at least that you're not having to find all of those costs up front, and you're just doing you're expending the bare minimum cost pre-planning where all the risk is, or a large amount of the risk is. And I think that the planners are mindful of that, and the other problem, of course, they face is they're also not supposed to put too many planning conditions on afterwards. So it's achieving a balance between you know, requiring things for validation, but then also what you can encapsulate within your planning conditions afterwards. But I think things like ground investigations certainly are those that should fall after planning, not pre-planning, or at least invasive ones, and not you know, a desktop survey perhaps is okay.
And Alan, did you come in just now because you were you wanted to talk about the affordability issue that you raised in the chat?
Well, thanks, Cany, yeah, and nice to see you, and Russell as well, and Jason. I could probably write a book about small sites. We've been doing them for over 20 years. And the troubling thing for me is that when I first started doing them, you could buy a site for under £100,000, probably, which even then is a lot of money. But now that same site is probably, without the benefit of any planning, just for a single house, probably £300,000, £400,000. So the affordability element has gone right out the window. I think when you were giving your presentation, King, you were saying that a lot of the local community that you've been talking to, you know, thought it might be a good idea that they could, you know, get together and contribute towards their pension pot at the end. And it definitely is, you know, is something that many local people that we talk to are interested in. But you know, I do worry that it is much more suited at the moment for individuals doing private houses or groups of houses as investments and to capitalize on the overall value. We finished 6 houses just next to our office here about a couple of years ago, and the site was bought at auction for £1 million. It took 3 years, and I think this is something where Russell has contributed a lot to the conversation, to get planning. Eventually won on appeal. Why? Because it was surrounded by 100 gardens on 3 sides of the plot, and every single resident objected. It went to appeal, and the inspector voted it through. The clients then sold on the site for £3.7 million. It's now built and it's worth £10 million or more for the 6 houses. So I think, you know, small sites are there. We should capitalize on them. They are inherently problematic, but they are mainly there, I think, as investment pots for either single individuals or developer builders who, you know, can do under 10 units quite happily, no affordable element attached other than maybe some Section 106 contributions. What I would really like to see is the councils using their backland sites and their car parks and their other properties that they own to develop 100% affordable housing for our key workers and people who are getting pushed out of the city. That's really it, I suppose.
Yeah, I think I think you're right on a lot of points there, Alan. I mean, the target audience for this document, and we have consulted with not only potential developers and planning officers, but also housing associations and the council themselves. So, we did a lot of work with Phoenix, for example, who have a lot of property and a lot of estates within Lewisham, some with L&Q, some with Lewisham Homes. So the target audience is also housing association, public landowners, and the document makes provision for small site development for them as well. Now the difficulty is that when we talk about a small site, we're talking about anything that's a quarter of a hectare or less. But it's the application site, not the ownership site, that we're talking about. So they may be bringing forward sites which are, small sites within a larger area, but it's still, we are also trying to capture the affordability within that as well, aiming it at the public landowners who should be bringing forward 100% affordable. So we're trying to make it easy for them as well.
I think I mentioned in the chat that back in 2004, we actually did work on 3 small sites, or infill sites, if you like. They were all petrol stations, one in Bromley Road, one in Lehigh Road, and one in Stansted Road. They're all standing there now. They were taken over by a housing association, all 3 of them. And on the larger scheme, which is 50 flats, a percentage of the building was given over to affordable rent, but the other percentage was for shared ownership. And I'm becoming increasingly averse to housing associations using shared ownership as a vehicle to really fund the rest of the development as such. I think what's happening is a lot of people are getting trapped in this shared ownership product.
I mean, it is a big problem just creating affordability in London. But Tom Atkinson has just put in something, who is our client. So do you want to come and unmute yourself and just explain?
Just mentioning.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I can. I mean, to first of all, just to say that, I mean, we've been so incredibly impressed with Cany and Russell, and we sort of dealt them a really hard brief when we started. As as Russell mentioned, this guidance sits in between our old local plan and our current new draft local plan. We wanted to make sure we were pushing as far as we could, but whilst also harking back to policy that is 10 years old, because that's the policy that we're currently working with. And the work they've done, and as if you've looked through the document, the sort of the mix between sort of very specific guidance, sort of numbers, facts and figures, and these diagrams with these sort of passionate sketches, has come across really well in the document. And overwhelmingly the councillors in the borough have absolutely loved the document and are really pleased to see it. I think just to answer that sort of question, I think affordability, like Russell said, was one of our biggest sort of hurdles, one of our biggest things with, small sites are, I mean, they can be everywhere. There's so much housing that could come on small sites within the borough, but it's just how do you make sure there is affordable contribution for that? And so the first thing to do is to sort of optimize the sites, making sure that developers aren't just building the non-house limit, and making sure that everywhere in the document it's pushing for what is optimum for that site, and making sure there's not overdevelopment where that's not necessary, but making sure there's not underdevelopment also. And then what's really handy is the new local plan proposes now a contribution for affordable housing, no matter what size of project, and it's a sliding scale of contribution, so it shouldn't impede in sort of development finance, because we're thoroughly aware that development finance on small sites is one of the hardest things, and this document is trying sort of it's best to sort of break down some of the risks that we can with planning policy. We obviously can't adhere to a lot of other risks, but break down the risks that we can break down to make it easier for those much smaller scale developers who are just trying to make a sort of a couple houses for a client who's got a large family or whatever it is. And that's been one of our key things. And I think, because a lot of the time when you think about small sites, you do think about the sort of, I mean, the developments that we've all seen as architects, the solid space homes, these things that are absolutely beautiful, great examples of architecture, incredibly expensive and only sort of high end. And what we want is to try and encourage, like you said, like, you know, community groups to be building on small private land and other different forms of developments, whether that's communities, whether that's a selection of neighbours to come forward. And it's difficult, but that's one of the things we've been trying to push, and we're hoping that within the consultation that we're doing now, we've got another what is it, sort of 8 weeks or 6 to 8 weeks of it now, that we'll get a bit more comment and we'll start to get people infused in this who haven't been thinking about it as much before. And so I think, so it would be great if everyone who has connections to Lewisham, sort of Alan, if you worked in Lewisham before, if you can comment on the guidance, on your thoughts. Yeah, that would be great. I don't know if that answered the question I was meant to answer.
Thank you so much, Tom, for your contribution.
So Jason, do we have our time's up, or
Yeah, it more or less is, yeah. Because the whole aim of this is trying to be a lunchtime thing, right? So yeah, we are 2 minutes overdue. Usually, if the conversation's still going, we can continue on. But these, I'll speak to Cany after about kind of what to do with the recording. But just want to say thank you again particularly to Cany for the wonderful talk. Thank you to Russell, Alan, Reza, Tom as well for contributing, and Cameron, of course. It's a pleasure to have so many delightful voices in the audience contributing as well to the conversation. So without further ado, there is obviously a CPD coming up next week and also the week after that as well. So do stay tuned. So a big thank you to everyone again for coming. I'll see you all next week.
thanks a lot.